Now we're going to listen to a very interesting person who has actually done some research and know things, apart from us, who don't know that many things about what we're talking about today. But still, Robert O'Keefe, please join me on the stage.
Thank you.
Welcome, Robert.
Thanks to be here.
Robert is the vice president of Health Effects
Institute.
And what do you do?
We push for clean air by understanding the health impacts of air pollution and create motivation in governments to set regulations and among people to believe in those regulations and take action.
And you've reported back to the US Congress and the European Parliament
that air pollution is a problem and that there are cost-effective solutions to that problem. The technologies are well known and there's ways forward if they would take action, basically.
I know you're eager to convey your message to the audience, but let me just ask, where do you get your fresh air from?
Where do we get our fresh air from?
You.
Personally, I live actually in a place that's very much like this. I'm very fortunate to live on the coast in Massachusetts, getting ocean air and great aesthetic beauty from salt marshes. So I'm a lucky guy.
All right.
Yeah.
You're lucky. You're one of those 5%.
No, I'm in the working class section of.
Okay, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and good morning for that. And thank you for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today as part of a remarkable panel, really, of experts to talk about the challenges that were laid out a little bit earlier by Sven and others. And I have to say it's a special privilege to come from the United States to be in a conversation about clean air and climate. It's been challenging to do that in the US of late, especially in a place like Sweden, where you are not only the recognized European leader, but the global leader as part of the broader Scandinavian community that deals with these issues. So in that sense, it's an honor to be here. It's also an honor to be here at the invitation of Sven, who visited the Health Effects Institute not too long ago to hear about these types of issues and talk about air pollution and health with a company that makes good products, has a good social responsibility and sustainability in making those products, and has a commitment to communicate to governments and people around the world about why clean air is important. So I'm really here to learn as much as I am to talk, and look forward to having a good day with all of you. So I'm the health guy, and I've sort of the job of being the problem definer. Will not come without solutions, but setting out the challenge, really, as opposed to the problem that Nederman and we're all here to solve. And I'll talk about that in a few ways. I'll talk about air pollution, old and new. How did we get here? What's the history of air pollution? When did it first become an issue? It might be surprising for you with some of the first observations. I'll talk about what we know today about the science and the current challenges in terms of implementing that science, and also, frankly, convincing people in some of the parts of the world where Nederman does business that air pollution is a problem and that there are ways forward. I was happy to hear you talk about Vietnam. I think that's an incredibly progressive country. It's where we did the first ever study of air pollution and health, working with the Vietnamese, very enthusiastic and energetic about dealing with these problems. A good example. I'll talk about the global burden of disease and tell you about where air pollution ranks relative to other risks that we all face from illness and disease as a global community, and who is most affected, and just a little bit on what the evidence is and where it comes from. Then I'll focus down on two key countries and, of course, two key markets, India and China, but in the context of the broader world. And I will talk about signs of progress, things that are moving forward, some reasons for optimism, and how we can all work together to get there. The place I work is the Health Effects Institute. We are an unusual nonprofit. You should know that we get half our funding from the US EPA, the regulators, and half our funding from the regulated entities, the worldwide motor vehicle industry, everyone who sells cars in the United States. So we're in that uncomfortable place in the middle, where we're funded by both to produce science that they can trust, working with NGOs, working with others, so that we are able to get some credibility for our work. We do work on PM, ozone, the major pollutants, the key sources around the world. And as I know Nederman understands really well, we spend a lot of time communicating to policymakers why this science is important. And we tend to have pretty high credibility for our work in terms of making regulations. So it's an interesting place to be. So how did we get here? Well, the first observations on air pollution were way back in the 1600s by John, and I'm sure there were people before that who swore about it, but he wrote about it. John Evelyn, an author and a diarist, who said, "This horrid smoke which obscures our churches and makes our palaces look old and fouls our clothes and corrupts our waters." He said that in 1640, and he called it the inconvenience of the air and smoke of London. So I know we all know about the Inconvenient Truth movie that Al Gore produced. He apparently wasn't the first one to use this reference. So there was another one before him. Air pollution is a long-term challenge, and really the modern era of air pollution came about in the mid-20th century with several disasters, one in the Meuse Valley in Belgium and one in Denora, Pennsylvania. And these were places where high levels of poor quality coal were being burned in rural areas, and then an inversion happened. The air became stagnant, levels rose, and people got sick. Those were rural experiences, and they were important, but they didn't draw anywhere near the notoriety of the London fog, which I think we all are quite familiar with in the 1950s, where high levels of also very cheap brown coal were burned not only by the industrial sector, but also by people living in an urban area. And the result of that was some 10,000 premature deaths, which is remarkable over a relatively short period of time, some 5 days. And what's interesting is even as the air pollution peaked, the mortality from air pollution actually lingered for quite a long time. And it gets to this notion of a lag period. So when people are exposed, the effects actually can take a while to manifest themselves. And that's sort of how exposure to air pollution works. But this is what happens in terms of peak experiences. So those episodes really became the catalyst for aggressive research to understand what are the exposures and adverse effects of pollution, what are the key pollutants and sources, looking at early time series studies. These are studies of these peak effects. When air pollution goes up or down on a particular day, do people die? How many people die? And what does that look like? But more importantly, and the focus of my talk today will be what are known as long-term studies. When people are exposed to low levels of air pollution throughout their life or for very long periods of time, especially particulate matter, what happens? And the bottom line is we've learned a lot, and this is very motivating to control measures, and it presents a challenge in communicating that credibly in the developing world, in the Indias, in the Chinas, in the Vietnams, because they can tend to see work done in the West as not relevant to their needs or their conditions, but it is. The two studies, and I'll just touch on these briefly, were really very famous anchors for air pollution and health science. The Harvard Six Cities study, which looked at some 8,000 people in the Midwestern United States, and in short found that people who lived in the most polluted city, Portage, Wisconsin, had a 26% greater risk of mortality than those living in another Midwestern city, Steubenville, Ohio, with lower levels of air pollution. It gave way to a national study of 500,000 people in the US, which found similar risks. And taken together, those studies now are part of a great, substantial global literature that deals with studies from North America, from Europe, and just a few in Asia, where the data is actually quite thin due to the technical capabilities that they lack there. But an emerging consensus, these lines basically, this is a no effect, was known as a no effect line. So when you see a black dot on the right side of this line, that means that there are effects at different levels of air pollution. So we're seeing a very consistent methodology that air pollution is a problem around the world in different cultures, and it needs action. Yes?
To us non-scientists, if you go back one slide.
Yeah.
What does that mean? I'm sorry, I'm not as clever as you are.
That's okay. No, that's okay. And I'm kind of giving a 35,000 foot view, but these are studies of what are known as cohorts or groups of people. You see the American Cancer Society study, those were 500,000 people. These were studies of cohorts or groups of teachers. A breast cohort to look at breast cancer that were retrofitted with data from air pollution. So you have these groups of people who are exposed, and you look at, well, what were the air pollution conditions? What did they live in? And did you see a positive effect?
Ah, right. Okay.
This line here is 1. That means there's no effect. So if you're below the line, you see no effect of air pollution. And if you're above the line, you see an effect on the order of 17 to 20% increased risk of mortality.
So only 3 of those studies, if I calculated correctly, would assume no effect.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Thanks.
And these lines on either side are what are known as confidence intervals, and that's how. So the result could fall anywhere along this line. It is placed in the most appropriate place mathematically. But if the confidence interval extends below 1, it's seen as positive, but not necessarily sort of a pure association. So basically, this is basically saying there's a lot of evidence from different populations in the US and in Europe, and some emerging studies in Asia talking about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
So those results that I spoke about a minute ago and I explained thanks to your question resulted in now what are the modern air quality standards for particulates. And particulates really are the best indicator of mortality. We have the best data. We have the highest impacts of mortality worldwide. These are some of the standards that exist today. The World Health Organization, 10 micrograms per cubic meter in terms of their air quality guidelines. The EPA, US EPA a little less stringent, and Europe a little less stringent than that. But it gives you a sense of what the standards are based on the science and the results that I just put up there. That's how these come about. And they've been adopted by many countries around the world. And as we all know, standards are one thing, enforcement and compliance are another, but there are standards there. And after your introduction, I feel like I should have labeled this the challenge instead of the problem, because I want to be positive. Having said that, the challenge is, as you mentioned, as Sven mentioned, over 90% of the world's population lives in areas above the WHO air quality guideline for PM10, which I just mentioned was 10. And the primary regions of the world where that's occurring are certainly Northern Africa, India, China. The most densely populated areas, of course, are here, so you hear the greatest health impacts fall in that part of the world. And we see progress in much lower levels in certainly the North America. Europe, Sweden is remarkably clean relative to other parts of the world, and certainly other parts of Europe, especially places like Poland. But this is the nature of the challenge. So what do those levels of exposure to air pollution tell us about health? And this is information cultivated from the State of Global Air, an annual report that's done every year. I'll explain where that comes from in a bit. But what it does is the bottom line is it labels air pollution as the 5th highest risk factor globally. So if we look at dietary risks, high blood pressure, even tobacco use, measures of diabetes, air pollution in terms of global mortality as a risk factor is number 5. It's very high on the list. And also it's above, you might be surprised, water safety and health, infectious diseases with unsafe water. So it's now the number 1 environmental risk factor, partly because we made a lot of progress on water issues and infectious disease that occur with them. This air pollution has become so close to tobacco smoke globally that in their major 2018 meeting in Geneva, WHO labeled air pollution the new tobacco, and they really weren't far wrong in doing that. The health impact of this in terms of mortality, and there are different numbers done by different groups, ours are pretty conservative, found that nearly 5 million premature deaths occurred in 2017 from exposure to PM 2.5 and air pollution more broadly, with China and India accounting for about 50% of that total, but significant effects in Europe, and they vary quite a lot. Of course, Eastern Europe is more problematic, with some 400,000 premature deaths a year and 100,000 in North America. The map clearly shows you the higher pollution and densely populated areas are the places where the health impacts and the mortality are highest. Air pollution, as you also might expect, is a major contributor to life expectancy, and you see similar risks, but you might be surprised to see that all cancers result in a lower life expectancy of about 2 years and 4 months. All air pollution is not so far behind, with a 20-month window in terms of reduced life expectancy that varies quite widely from country to country. Higher in Bangladesh and India, certainly lower in the developed world. And we also begin to see the breakout between ambient air pollution, the outdoor air pollution we all breathe, and household air pollution, which is a real problem. In India, China, Some of the places in the world where in India, for instance, 60% of the population uses biofuels, biomass for indoor cooking and heating. So a real challenge here as well. Air pollution is disproportionate effects on the poor, those of low socioeconomic status for perhaps the obvious reasons. They have poor diets, they cook over biomass fuels and fires, using biomass fuels and indoor cooking. So they have higher exposures as a result of that. This is in simple terms. And frankly, they don't have funding to get medical care if they come down with lower respiratory illness, pneumonia, and other diseases associated with air pollution. So it's a disproportionate effect among the poor as well. So having given you a little bit of a background on the nature of air pollution, how we got here, just a few words on where the data comes from. It's a remarkable global coalition called the Global Burden of Disease, the GBD, and it's led by Chris Murray and his group at the University of Washington, the Health Metrics and Evaluation entity at the University of Washington. And they've recently signed an agreement with the World Health Organization so that their methodology, their approach, will become the basis for WHO calculating their numbers moving forward. So this is highly relevant from a global perspective. And what it is it's a systematic scientific effort to quantify the magnitude of health loss from disease and injuries. All countries around the world, or nearly all, 195, some 3,600 researchers do this every year. And they look at disease and injuries, and also like cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, HIV/AIDS. These are the things we die from and get sick from, and the risk factors associated with those. So smoking, diet, high blood pressure. Classic pairs are smoking and lung cancer, or unsafe sex and HIV/AIDS. Those types of relationships, and this is what gives us the ability to put together a chart with consistent methodology worldwide and see where air pollution ranks relative to these other lists, and why it's alarming that it's quite so high on the list. These are the diseases, just briefly, that are linked to air pollution, and they're heart attack and stroke, lung cancer, pneumonia, and diabetes. So when the numbers for air pollution are calculated, the researchers told us that these are the diseases that are most affected when air pollution rises or falls, and we see the primary effects. There's a second set of diseases, emerging evidence, such as preterm birth, infants exposed whose mothers are exposed to high levels of air pollution during gestation, or asthma mortality, of course not asthma exacerbation, which air pollution is well associated with, and cognitive impairment. These are diseases where the evidence isn't quite strong enough to say that there's a causal relationship between air pollution and health, but in the future could lead to some of the increases in the numbers that we're seeing today. So having said that and giving you a little bit of a background on the history of air pollution, how it's looked at, where it ranks, I want to talk about two countries, China and India, with a substantial population, obviously very important markets, and talk about the impacts, the sources, and a little bit on the future directions in terms of what we're seeing there. And first, in China, air pollution is one of the top-ranking risk factors for premature mortality, as you might well imagine, with some 1.2 million of the world total mortality occurring in China, or almost 12% of Chinese deaths. Stroke, from among the causes that I mentioned, is the most common cause of air pollution that's linked to PM. And I should say, just to give you a little bit of a context as we move forward, that the average annual concentration that's population weighted, that's where the people live, what are the levels of air pollution where people live, is about 53 micrograms per cubic meter. As I mentioned, the WHO stringent standard is about 10. The China standard was 40. So that gives you a sense about the levels that they're currently being exposed to. And there will be some good news here. We did some looking at China in the global burden of disease, major air pollution sources, to see what are the key sources that are linked to air pollution and health. And the real source that emerges in a number of places is coal, whether it's industrial coal burning, whether it's coal burning for power plants, or domestic coal burning, because a lot of people still use coal indoors. So the total coal mortality rate is almost 366,000. What's interesting is that transportation, which we tend to jump to, is considerably less than combined coal. And then you have non-coal industry, which includes smelters and other industries that burn oil, open burning, and other sources that are considerably lower. So interesting to see what the major sources in China are. Turning to India, we see a similar but somewhat different picture. The total mortality from air pollution is about the same, about 1.2 million deaths in 2017. The big difference here is nearly 500,000 or 500,000 were attributed to household air pollution. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, about 60% of the Indian population is still rural, even in the context of very significant urbanization around the world. Give you a sense of, and I should say that in India, another thing that's quite remarkable is air pollution ranks under two different indices of disease, including malnutrition and dietary risks, so sort of underweight and overweight, which India has both problems. India air pollution is next, and it's actually above tobacco smoking, which is somewhat remarkable. And of course, that's because everyone's exposed to air pollution and only a subset of the population smokes. And finally, on this slide, just to give you a feel, the average population-weighted exposure in India is about 91 micrograms per cubic meter, so quite high. In India, the major sources reflecting the high mortality from indoor are residential biomass burning, some anthropogenic dusts, but then again, power plant and industrial coal combined being the next highest. Much open burning, brick production, brick kilns. So you can see it's a little bit of a less developed society overall, and the sources are somewhat different. We did an interesting exercise in India looking ahead. We're bold enough to say, well, what's going to happen without action in 2050? It's given the rate of change in the world today, one has to take these with a grain of salt. But if we look at sort of business as usual today with the different sources that I just mentioned, and with modest and advanced control technologies, we see that the blue bar and the orange bar are power plant and industrial coal, and they're really going to persist for the foreseeable future. And that's, I think India's been very clear about their willingness to extract more coal and meet their energy needs. Certainly a very large percentage of their population is still without energy. They feel like they have a right to bring power to people, and they're seeing coal as a major way to do that. So that's one of the certainly the challenges here. So signs of progress, finally. It took me a little while to get here, but there are signs of progress. Yes, this is true. There are problems, but Sven talked about China earlier. I think the China story is very promising, and I think you're right to point out that it's taken a long time to get to this place in China. There's a long way to go, but I have to say that the comprehensiveness of the change that the Chinese have undertaken in terms of addressing the air pollution issue is quite remarkable. It's captured in this report called Breakthroughs from Clean Air Asia, which is a semi-independent organization. And what they did is they looked at a range of measures. They looked at air quality standards and monitoring. China has very solid standards, and they're monitoring emissions from individual sources, creating emissions inventories and source apportionment. The coal pollution, the industrial pollution, and the vehicle sectors were all subject to very aggressive compliance and enforcement. Some of the stories that came out of the China MEP, the regulatory agency in China, were that their inspectors were being overworked from 2013 to 2017, spending so much time in the field doing compliance enforcement at these facilities that they actually complained. So that was a real change. One of the other interesting parts in changes in China and hopeful signals were these government reforms, and obviously they're a command and control economy, but the government reform really went down through the entire organization. Local government leaders had air quality levels put in their performance reviews, and they were held accountable for that. They were very good at regional cooperation across the different provinces, and also interdepartmental coordination at the national level. So the energy agency would talk to the environment agency and technologies and fuels and what's coming, and they planned ahead, and they did a really good job. For me, in all of this, I tend to believe that transparency of information and public awareness is the key, pretty much no matter where you are. And in China, as we know, it's a fairly closed society in terms of information, but for some reason in the air pollution arena, There has been a great transparency of information. You can get an air quality index listing the levels of air pollution in most towns in China. It's accessible. People tweet about it on Weibo or communicate about it on Weibo. And they understand what the health impacts are. And I think this is the key driver because people are aware, they keep pressure on their politicians, they know their kids could get sick, and I think this is the important motivator over time. This is evidence of the initial changes that we've seen in China from the Global Burden of Disease report, starting about the same time as their control measures, 2010, going through 2015, and we're seeing the beginning of a decline. And if you were to look at this line, which goes back to 1990, you would see just a steady rise. So this is a sign of hope, even though we're pretty far away from the WHO interim target 1. It's heading in the right direction. The challenge will be to see whether the Chinese keep up with this as the economy faces challenges, but I'm pretty optimistic they will for lots of reasons. You don't need this slide. I just put this in here. I just made those same points, but I have to give credit to this man, He Kebin. He and his colleague Hao Zhiming were the architects of China's clean air program from Tsinghua University. It was a major professional risk. These are atmospheric engineers. As you can see, he's a very happy person with Joachim Steiner, pointing to all the reductions across different parts of China in air pollution from 2013 to 2017. They deserve a lot of credit, and it was a happy day. In India, actions, I know this is my positive news, actions are a little more tentative. The government, the Modi government has stepped out and they've done the National Clean Air Action Program, the first national program for air pollution and air quality management. So that's a great step forward. There are very good standards for stationary sources, including new, more stringent ones for thermal powered, coal-powered power plants. They did a very good thing in terms of leapfrogging from essentially Euro 6 to Euro 4 to Euro 6 in the vehicle front. So that was aggressive. Their UI program was a program to bring LPG gas to the rural areas. Some 70 million rural households got tanks of LPG with a refill and the technology to burn that LPG to reduce indoor exposure to cooking. Whether that lasts or not, we have to see, but that's a really good start. I think compliance in India is a question. I think that's probably frustrating for Nederman and others who have good products and want to bring those to market. I think they'd like to see some very good compliance and solid standards to comply with in terms of markets. There are structural challenges, I think. The central government and the states often talk by each other. And coal mining is increasing. They just recently opened coal mining to companies outside of India for the first time. On the other hand, and India gets credit for this, renewables, as I'm sure you'll hear from Connie, are showing a rapid rise in Asian nations, with China certainly in the lead, but India certainly on the uptick with a commitment to renewables, and the Modi government has really articulated that as a way forward. So that's great. And our research tells us that as countries meet, as in this case the world, meets the WHO guidelines progressively, one after another, life expectancy gains will come back. Air pollution reductions will result in people living longer by breathing cleaner air. Sounds obvious, but the data shows that as well. The last couple slides, and the good news is that historically, certainly in the US, and I'm sure in most parts of Europe, air quality management is a good deal. This is an example of the US highway diesel rule, where particle filters came into heavy-duty diesels and extremely low sulfur fuels were required, and we saw monetized benefits on the order of 30 to 1, the cost of implementation versus the avoided health impacts and other impacts to society of lost work days from this one rule. So there's substantial net benefits from environmental protection that I think are widely recognized, and especially air quality management. And from a big picture perspective, and Sven put up a slide like this earlier, this is a little bit more detailed, but if you look at in the United States, the Clean Air Act, the major regulation for reducing air pollution across the country, from 1980 to 2017, economic activity was up, GDP, miles traveled, population, energy consumption, not that these are all good, but we were able to live a good life and see emissions decline significantly, some 67%. So there's no as we know, conflict between environment and economic development. So just the last couple slides, where do we go from here? Where's the science taking us? I showed you what levels air pollution was a problem at. This is a bit of the next challenge. This work was preceded by a Canadian study, a major study of air pollution and health. Again, these low levels of air pollution, people who live in Canada, and actually a very clean parts of the country, looking at their exposures and disease incidence, mortality incidence, and they found effects below the current WHO standard and national standard for Canada. It was only one study, and so the question became, well, is this real? And so we've initiated a major undertaking with 6 million Canadians, 61 million Americans, elderly Americans using Medicare data, and 31 million Europeans across, I think, 12 different countries in Europe to look at exposure to these very low levels of air pollution and health, and to see what they're telling us about what's happening below the standard, looking ahead to see whether the effects we've been seeing in the past are real. So the initial results are in from the US study. It was the first one to publish a portion of their work. It was published in the prestigious journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and evoked actually an editorial that went along with this, pointing out the seriousness of the problem. But this is an exposure response curve, basically levels of air pollution and levels of exposure. And the previous science had reliable linear, what's known as a linear correlation. When you have an exposure, you have an effect down to about 10 or 12. That's why WHO set their standard there in terms of exposure to PM. This latest research is showing effects down almost to zero, really having difficulty finding a threshold of exposure to PM where there's not a health impact. So this has certainly implications for limit values in Europe and risk assessments in terms of what the economic impacts of air pollution are looking ahead. In the European and Canadian teams, their work's not quite finished yet, but the initial results are showing similar, are looking to be similar. It's still an HEI peer review. We're known for really rigorous peer review, and there's a lot more work to be done. But this seems to be the future of at least PM regulation. It's going to be around for a while. It's a good market to invest in. It's not like these effects are going to go away. We don't expect the science is going to change. So my last slide, just closing points. The big picture here is global air quality is a long-term challenge, given where it started and where it needs to go. The levels remain high, especially low and middle-income countries. And the health impacts of air pollution, including mortality, respiratory diseases, and especially effects among the elderly, the poor, and the asthmatics. I didn't talk about this. These are the susceptibles, the people who are most affected by air pollution really exist. We've made much progress to date in high-income countries. I think there's a lot to be proud of. Certainly there's more to do. But if you look at the historical trends for developed countries, we've really come a long way with really good regulation and very good compliance and technology. Initial progress in low and middle income countries. In some places, China has made progress. I have to say and emphasize again, I think public opinion and knowledge and understanding is a key driver, but also emerging technical ability to target key sources and to have technologies that can address those problems will be key. And finally, the solutions are exceedingly cost effective, and there's a whole part of this that could deal with climate co-benefits, which I'm sure Connie will mention. So there are benefits to reducing air pollution, which in turn drives cleaner industries, less fuel use, more efficiency that are important to mention as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Yeah.
I've got so many questions.
Uh-oh.
But let's see if there's anyone out there. Do you everything is crystal clear?
May I
Congratulations.
have a question?
No, you may not.
Sorry.
Yes, of course. Please, Sven.
When you say what's happening now is that we are increasing seeing that there are indications that the cognitive abilities are affected. You can also see that even much lower areas, lower exposure will have an effect. It's not proven, but it's indication. At the same time, we see in some parts, you are from US, of the Western world becoming complacent that we are so much better than the Chinese and so on? Because I see some rollbacks in US at the moment, and it happens also in some other places.
You noticed. Yes, it's an interesting challenge. There's, I think, always a tension between regulation and the economy, and there can be pushback. I think when people feel threatened economically, it can be easy to demonize regulatory regimes as a reason for that. And you know, deregulation happens. I think it's not entirely bad. Sometimes there's the regulations that need to be sunsetted, and they're not useful anymore. 20 years ago, the United States actually looked at the science, raised the ozone standard just a little bit, and then they went back the other way. So it's not a bad thing to do to ask these questions, but a wholesale retreat on environmental regulations is concerning, number one. Number two, I think people experience clean air. I mean, they go outside, they're beautiful days. You know, Sweden has their problems as well, even though it's probably the cleanest country in Europe. So it's easy to sort of become complacent and not feel the effects unless you live in LA or unless your kid has asthma and there's asthma exacerbation on high pollution days. That's why it's really critical to emphasize the personal, not just the numbers, but sort of the personal effects of air pollution, because I think that these days, when truth is being questioned, I think that's what resonates with people. And just the last point on that is I worry about that with China, because their push has been to get to blue skies. And I think China will get to blue skies, and the skies are going to look pretty good, but the air pollution is still going to be pretty high, and the mortality impacts will be there. And so one of their tests will be, as they move along the economic development spectrum and the environmental spectrum, is whether they keep pushing once people don't notice the problem in quite the same way. It's a real challenge.
Talking about regulations, and how are you going to, what's the sort of most beneficial way to come to terms with these problems or challenges? Is it through regulations or costs, fees, or more incentives?
Well, I mean, frankly, in the US, I think it's more of the same. I think the air quality standards that we have in place, the water quality standards we have in place, if you look back over the last 30 years, we've seen remarkable improvements in air quality. And as those are extended from industry to industry, we have the technology, we have the know-how, we had pretty good enforcement and compliance, and we're seeing a steady decline in air pollution. And then there's a whole set of climate incentives, of course, that will further incentivize a move to a carbon-free society that obviously will have benefits for air pollution, as air quality measures also have benefit for climate. So I feel like a lot of what's happened to date has worked, frankly. So,
but when you showed that chart with GDP rising while emissions declining, but that's emissions not in total, but per
capita. Right.
Okay, so assuming that UN is correct, that we will be like 10 billion people in 20 years.
Right. This is, yes, and the new US population.
The total volume of emissions.
Right. And the US population is not increasing at that rate, so we're not seeing that problem, but other parts of the world are increasing dramatically. And, you know, India is a good example. The slide that I put up on transportation in India was very low. I think it was one of the lowest, had the lowest health impacts, but I think the last data I saw was that only 1 in 10 people in India who could buy cars have purchased vehicles. So the growth potential is astronomical, and also India and China's population are both growing rapidly. So that's, yeah, you're right, that's going to be a major challenge.
And what's the most problematic item we buy or use?
There's a lot of targets.
I know you're funded by the car industry, but still.
No. Actually, I take exception to that.
Yeah.
We are funded equally by EPA, equally by the car industry. The only control either one has over our governance is they have to agree on our board members.
Okay.
Once the board is appointed, they have total control over what we do, and it's all autonomous. So, I have
Okay.
to,
Sorry about that.
and I'll follow that up with the what needs to be done and what's the most problematic is really place-based. If you're in India, you really want to be focusing on the indoor environment. It's critical.
Okay.
If you
So
want
that's where Nederman can really play a major role.
right.
Yeah.
If you want to be focusing in the U.S. and or European cities, old dirty diesel is a real problem. And in the U.S. and in California, current vehicles are a problem. So we need to begin to move to, as is obvious, to EVs and other less polluting forms of transportation. So it's very much place-based.
I was terrified to hear that China air pollution accounted for 12% of all deaths, you said. And in India it was 13%.
Correct.
It's amazing.
It is amazing. Like I said earlier, though, not everyone smokes.
No.
Not everyone gets sick, but everyone breathes bad air. From the young to the old, and it varies by country. You know, the older people are more susceptible to air pollution. Countries with more elderly populations see a higher mortality, but it is a large association between air pollution and mortality. Yeah, and it's, you know, the good news is it's solvable. As Sven pointed out, we have the technologies, we have the approaches, we have the standards, and I think it's creating the will to pursue those is where our challenge lies, especially in developing economies where there are so many other competing needs. I think China's crossed the barrier. They're wealthy enough so they can care about air pollution. India's not quite there yet, I think, but is on the way.
Is it a problem that we tend to focus so much on, even if those two things are related, but we tend to focus so much on climate change today that we forget that 12% of the Chinese population dies every year of air pollution?
You know, that paradigm has shifted quite a bit, and Connie, I think, would know about this. Back 10 or 15 years ago, when An Inconvenient Truth came out, there was so much momentum, at least in my country, Europe, and others have had more momentum all along on climate. We were doing air pollution work, and all of our money went away. Our funders took all of the money that went to air quality management and put it into climate change, and it actually became difficult to do what we do. That's changed since there's been pushback on climate. That's been pretty visible. And there's been, the foundations have all come back and they said, well, actually, if we invest in air quality management, it's an easier sell. Governments understand that the health impacts of their people matter. People care. It's in their local press. They can see results quite quickly. And so they're much more willing to do that. And climate, to some, can be a little bit more abstract. So I think the combination of the two initiatives together are both quite powerful.
So they could be powerful, but are they? Or is it so that we tend to focus more on climate change and forget about those sort of immediate problems we face?
Others could talk about that. That's our reason for existing in, especially the developing world, is that the best way to get through climate is through health impacts, and it's an educational process. And I think that's why awareness, transparency of information is critical in making that happen.
Well, it was very disturbing to learn about the Chinese development in terms of the 12% of the population dying of air pollution. It was encouraging to hear you say that it seems like there's a great awareness in China these days.
There is, and I think there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, among the public, I mean, China wants to be a world leader, obviously, and you can't be a world leader if people are trying to land in your airports and they're fogged out because of air pollution. So there's an image issue there, I think, that's a big driver for China. I think they're also in a place where they've crossed over from becoming a developing economy in terms of technological capability to one where they're actually getting quite sophisticated. Our colleagues at Tsinghua University didn't just run the analysis for China on the health impacts of air pollution, but they did it for India, they did it for the rest of the world. So we're in partnership with leading Chinese institutions who are quite sophisticated. They want to be in a position to start projecting that technology outward using some of the platforms that exist to let the world know that China has products to bring to market and they're good ones. So there's lots of reasons, I think, why they're motivated. And part of it is the public as well.
But while the Chinese are, in this sense, open to reveal air pollution through all these different indexes,
Yes.
What do they do?
What?
What do they do to address these problems? I mean, in terms of how does this Chinese government address these challenges?
Well, I think it was.
Is it by sort of increased fees, or is it regulation, or?
I tried to capture that in the slide on the measures that China's taken, and clearly they now are in a position to require. They have solid standards. Lots of countries have standards. As you can tell, I'm a little cynical about standards being the answer, but Russia has some of the toughest in the world. So China has solid standards. They actually enforce them, and they've had a concerted effort sending the inspectors out into the field to enforce it at stationary sources. They have very strict vehicle standards. They're moving pretty quickly on EVs and putting in place an infrastructure for that. They understand that renewables are going to be a good business going forward, and have invested way more certainly than the United States in that arena. And so they have the sophistication, they have the motivation, and they're doing it. I mean,
Okay.
I think they're really doing it. And the data that I put up there, that was an independent report that assessed the aggressiveness of Chinese enforcement and the measures that they've taken. And they're tracking their progress as well. And I should say that, it's a benefit of a command and control government. They can say something's going to happen and it's going to happen. In India, it's a big messy democracy like a lot of the places we live in, and government says one thing, industry pushes back, there's this dialogue, but when China puts their mind to it, I think they can move forward. Again, it's an early stage. You don't want to sort of give them too much credit, especially when the economy tightens and they maybe have job issues, whether they revert. But for the moment, I think they're quite committed to taking these steps.
So China addressing the issues, doing something, while India lacking the knowledge, the interest.
I think India is, I think I'd be a little more charitable in that. I think they're at a different stage of economic development. I think people there have still significant concerns about housing, about food, basic needs. And so I think air pollution is one, and water quality in India is terrible. So I think they have a lot of social challenges. And so getting a deeper understanding of the health impacts and the benefits of the cost effectiveness of reducing air pollution from a health perspective there's a lot of education needed, there's a lot of capacity building needed. Frankly, there's a need for industries to come in and industries speak with a different voice. They're not NGOs, they're not researchers who could be characterized as wanting to do another study. They're there with a product to sell and a solution. And I think industry has a unique position, I think, in India, as with other governments, to shape change by both the products that they bring in, but also the behaviors and the philosophy that they bring, as Nederman knows.
Sven, any reflections? While you think about some questions. And can we put off the light? Thank you.
No, I think it's always interesting to hear Health Effect Institute, and it sort of gives you a reflection that 12% or 13%, and even the fact that we see that we cannot be complacent. We need to continue. Although we see a blue sky, we realize that there are challenges, but there are, as I always try to point out, there are also solutions, and as Robert is also pointing out, the technology is there. Let's use it.
But what challenges do you face when you address these issues in Vietnam or India or China?
Very often it's seen as a financial investment with the payback, and of course if you consider clean air or consider air to be a free resource that you can pollute and someone else will pay for it, then of course it's cheaper not doing anything. And I think that's where the regulation, or also not only regulation but also consumer behavior, it's not okay. And I think that we see that from consumer goods companies, they are more aware and more on their toes compared to not pointing finger at the steel mill, but they are definitely less active and less sensitive to these issues. So we as consumer has an enormous responsibility.
And then maybe we can rely more on Miss Lee.
Yes.
Because she is aware.
She's aware, and it seems like the younger generation they have, because it also comes with growing wealth, because they are reasonably well fed, they are getting education and so on, and then they have sort of the time to reflect on other things in life. And one good thing is, even if you can hurt a leg, going out to the forest and into nature, a clean nature, it is a joy in life.
To breathe the clean air. We need to touch on one thing. I know it's sensitive, but I mean, you're an American. We read about Donald Trump.
Yes.
Right.
What's your point?
It seems like he's not that interested in these things, is my sort of interpretation.
You mean he doesn't believe in climate change?
No.
Right. And I think the head of EPA is a climate doubter. I think it would be a little more nuanced than that. I think they would say that there's climate change occurring, but they couldn't necessarily link it to human activity.
Okay.
So yes, it's an issue. There's also...
Is that more of a problem than a challenge?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
This is speaking personally, not from my institution. There's also, it's been harder to get information about climate. Databases that used to be available are not available anymore, and so even basic
Why is that?
tracking data.
Database is not available anymore.
There used to be regular data on climate that was posted in different websites in the government that aren't kept quite as current anymore and made available. Why that happens, we can speculate on, but yeah. So it's not front and center. And you go to education, and I think it goes to, and we can talk about this later this afternoon. The importance of leadership in defining problems, and when we have, and the importance of having faith in global institutions to solve common problems, and how isolationism can run counter to that. So a series of challenges there, things to work on, for sure.
It's a very politically correct answer, isn't it? But I see. But while Donald Trump might be a climate doubter, he could be interested in air pollution.
Sure.
Yeah?
Yes.
Because, I mean,
Yes,
what-
yeah.
he may
touts-
not
yes.
be part of sort of global warming in the end because he's a bit older. But he's breathing the air.
I think the administration points with pride at the progress that's been made in the U.S. through air quality management, so and clean water management. As I said, we've come a long way, and people are really willing, I think, to take credit for that justifiably. Where I think the issue, of course, with climate is being conflated with jobs and the coal industry facing significant downturns. And whether or not at the end of the day that's going to be successful, I think is a huge question mark. But that's a little bit what resonates with people is employment and economy. And if it's couched in those terms, I think it can be persuasive. Although we both put up data earlier that says that it's possible to move forward with environmental regulation and economic growth at the same time.
Would a change in power in Washington next year, would that sort of change things?
It always changes things when governments change.
Right. It's soon
I'm the
time for a
health
coffee
guy.
break, and then we will really ask you questions.
I'm the health guy.
I see. Please, there is a question over there somewhere. Yes, do you have a microphone? Oh, you already have one.
Yeah,
Good.
I have it.
Great, welcome.
Good morning. My name is Mauricio, and I work for Nederman do Brazil.
Good morning.
But I will not ask anything related to the rainforest. My question is regarding the working environment. We know by practice that the pollution inside the factories are much stronger than outside. And my question is, was this effect neutralized from the statistics that you've shown? And the second is, do you have any information about mortality, for example, related to the air pollution in the working environment?
Sure. The occupational exposures arena is an entirely different area of analysis, and different specialists look at that because there are different challenges. One of them, of course, is the healthy worker effect, where pollutants in the workplace, even though they're highly toxic and workers need to be protected, can be more problematic in the ambient air because they're susceptible populations. Workers tend to be pretty healthy. Having said that, especially in developing countries, fugitive emissions from smelters, from operations, welding and other operations at facilities in developing countries happen in the open air a lot. So they become ambient emissions as well as occupational exposures. And in that sense, that's a real place, I think, where Nederman can make a contribution to ambient air quality as well as worker safety. It's a really nice crossover. And there's also, frankly, the fact of corporate stewardship and a company who's coming in with a good product, who's concerned about protecting their workers. Sometimes in countries where there's not a priority given to that, which also spills over, I think. You deal with regulatory agencies and you deal with the publics and others, and it really does help raise awareness of the broader implications of exposures to air pollution, especially, as I mentioned, among the more susceptible. So it's a great position to be in, I think, with the products that you have and the competitive advantage that you have going into some of these countries.
Do we have a microphone to the gentleman over there? Here, in the middle of the aisle. Here you go.
Thank you. My name is Patrick. The US just became the biggest oil producer in the world. How do they?
You mean from last night?
Yeah, from last night. How do they compare to other oil producers? How do they affect the air?
I didn't hear this. Which oil producer?
Compared to all the other oil producers in the world, how do the US oil production affect the environment and the climate and the air?
I think my experience with, we have a new startup that's just occurred to understand the health impacts of exposure to, it's an energy startup to fracking. And this is speaking in very general terms because it's not my specialty, but there tends to be a preference among some of the larger oil industries, in my experience, for consistent, comprehensive regulation across large geographic areas that doesn't exist among some of the smaller producers. In my country, the smaller producers operate at a state level. There's lots of variation and not very much stringency, a variation in stringency in terms of regulatory concerns, setbacks from facilities, those types of discharges, those types of things. Some of the larger companies who work across the country and around the world have good technologies. They are, in many cases, concerned about potential impacts, partly because they want to keep their markets. And so they tend to be a little bit more progressive, I think, in terms of some of the operations and the regulations that affect them. So I think it needs to be answered, I think, on a larger and smaller scale, bigger and smaller actors.
You know, a moderator's most important task is to make sure that we keep the schedule. Okay. One, brief, because you're from Nederman.
Okay. I just wanted to ask one question. I read a study not too long ago where they showed that lung cancer has been reduced, and that's historically been strongly associated with smoking.
Right.
But now they actually see that with smoking completely more or less disappeared, people still get lung cancer. So they basically think this has been masked behind smoking as being the main driver. But the interesting thing in this study, nowhere in that anyone mentioned anything about air pollution control or about the air quality, which one would think, based on this discussion, may be one of the underlying reasons. So my question on it is, do you measure anywhere what the public awareness is about this kind of issues, how important it is to people? As we mentioned before, a lot is talking about climate change and those things today, but there's not that big discussion about this. And do you measure that somewhere? What's the long-term trends? Do people care about these matters or not? Do they understand them? What's your view on that?
You know, I debated, time was short, but I debated putting up some of the coverage that we get every year from releasing the State of Global Air. And We found that the work is translated into, I think last time it was 18 different languages, and generated news media articles in most major countries around the world. And people really care. Air pollution resonates with people. Everybody knows somebody with asthma. You know, everybody's got an elderly parent who's more susceptible. I think it's quite clear that air pollution is associated with lung cancer, and smoking is not the only issue there. But this notion of raising awareness, I think, is the central issue for me, I think, because I think regulations and commitment to technology and being willing to spend money on air quality management, I think comes from public awareness to putting pressure on public officials to creating markets for these products. And so I think it's the awareness is critical.
Robert, time is running out. Sven told me a couple of days ago that you and your institute is really doing a marvelous job, and now we understand why. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.